dragging my suitcase up the stone steps of my $5 million Charleston mansion. I just wanted a hot shower after 2 grueling weeks away. Instead, a gleaming new lock blocked my door. My belongings were shoved into cheap boxes outside, while inside, my chandeliers blazed. My brother thought he was simply stealing a house. He had no idea he was stepping into a legal machine built to crush anyone who treated family like a license to pillage. My name is Chloe Green. I am 36 years old, and for the past 2 weeks, I had been buried alive in Philadelphia, dissecting a massive corporate fraud case for Alder and Wren Risk Advisory. I make my living hunting down hidden assets, unspooling lies told by desperate people in tailored suits, and proving mathematically that greed always leaves a paper trail. I was exhausted to my bones. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets for 14 hours a day, and the damp chill of the Charleston evening clung to my coat. But my mind, trained to spot the single misplaced comma in a 1,000-page ledger, was razor sharp, at the top of the steps, craving nothing more than the silence of its thick walls. I pulled my heavy brass key from my pocket. and slid it into the lock. It did not turn. I pushed harder. The key bit into the metal, but the mechanism refused to yield. I stepped back, my eyes adjusting to the dim porch light. The antique brass deadbolt, original to the century-old door, was gone. In its place sat a sleek, matte black electronic keypad, blinking a tiny red indicator light. It looked like an alien parasite latched onto the aged cypress wood. I lowered my gaze. Stacked haphazardly against the far railing of the porch were 8 flimsy cardboard boxes. They were not moving boxes from a reputable company. They were the cheap, thin kind you buy in bulk at a discount office supply store. I walked over to the nearest one. The flaps were just folded over, not even taped shut. I flipped the top open. Inside, crumpled under a pile of my winter coats, were my personal tax documents, framed photographs from my college graduation, and my grandmother Evelyn's leather-bound notebook. The spine of the notebook was bent, the pages splayed open, tossed in with a handful of random charging cables and half-empty bottles of expensive lotion. They had packed up my life and left it outside like trash awaiting the morning collection. Taped to the top of the center box was a piece of pale blue stationery. I recognized the heavy cardstock immediately. It belonged to my mother, Diane. Her cursive handwriting, usually so elegant and practiced, was slightly hurried. The ink was dark navy. "We are doing this because we love you," the note read. "Mason needs stability. You need rest." I read the words twice. The audacity of it did not spark anger right away. It sparked a chilling, analytical curiosity. I turned away from the boxes and walked toward the side window. The heavy velvet drapes I usually kept drawn were pulled wide open. I pressed my face close to the glass, shielding the glare of the street lamp with my hands. The interior of my home had been violated. The entryway, previously an open expanse of polished hardwood and minimal, antique furniture, was cluttered with strange objects. There were tall stands holding sample floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and blush roses. Large presentation boards leaned against the wainscoting, displaying wedding color palettes and fabric swatches. Rolls of high-end curtain material were stacked near the staircase, alongside crates of decorative lighting fixtures. Someone was not just moving in. Someone was staging my home, transforming it into a commercial venue. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my brother. Mason Green answered on the second ring. The background noise on his end was hushed, perhaps a restaurant or a quiet lounge. "Chloe," Mason said. His voice was unsettlingly calm, dripping with the practiced warmth he used when pitching real estate to wealthy out-of-towners. "I am glad you got the note. I told Mom you would probably get in tonight." "Mason," I replied, my tone flat, stripped of any familial inflection. "Why is there an electronic lock on my front door? And why are my personal belongings in 8 cardboard boxes on the porch?" He let out a soft, patronizing sigh. We had an intervention. Chloe, Mom, Dad, and I. Brooke was there too. We have all been incredibly worried about you. You are working yourself to death. You are never here. You are completely disconnected from reality. I was working in Philadelphia, I stated, on a scheduled audit. For 2 weeks. It is not just the 2 weeks, Mason countered smoothly, stepping into his pre-rehearsed narrative. You are spiraling, the hours you keep, the isolation. You are simply not in a state of mind to manage a property of this magnitude. It is irresponsible to let an asset like the Green Harbor House sit empty and unmaintained while you have whatever kind of breakdown you are having. We stepped in to protect you, and to protect the family's legacy. The family's legacy, I repeated. The phrase tasted like ash. My house had nothing to do with the family legacy. It was mine. I have assumed legal management of the property, Mason continued, his confidence swelling. I have the notarized paperwork to prove it. You need to take some time. Chloe, rent a nice quiet apartment. Check into a retreat. Get some rest. We are taking the burden off your shoulders. You broke into my house, I said. I secured an asset, he corrected. For your own good. He hung up. I did not call him back. Instead, I stood on the porch, feeling the cold wind off the harbor. 15 minutes later, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the silence. A private security patrol vehicle pulled up to the curb, closely followed by a local police cruiser. They had clearly been tipped off to expect a disturbance. A single police officer stepped out, shining a heavy flashlight over the lawn, sweeping it up to where I stood next to my boxes. A private security guard flanked him, holding a clipboard. Evening. Ma'am, the police officer said, keeping his distance. We received a call from the property manager. Stated there might be an unauthorized individual attempting to access the premises. I am the owner of this home, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. My name is Chloe Green. My brother has illegally changed the locks while I was out of town. The private security guard stepped forward and handed the officer a clear plastic folder. We have instructions from Mr. Mason Green, the authorized property manager. He provided notarized documentation earlier today, establishing his right of possession and management. He warned us his sister might show up and cause a scene due to some ongoing mental health struggles. The police officer glanced at the papers in the folder, illuminated by his flashlight. He sighed, the universal sound of a public servant who did not want to deal with a wealthy family's drama. Ma'am, the officer said, his tone shifting to one of weary patience. I am looking at a notarized power of attorney and a property management agreement here. Both look official on their face. If you are disputing who has the right to be in this house, this is a civil matter. I cannot force entry, and I cannot kick him out based on a verbal claim, especially when he has paper and you do not have a key that works. It is a fraudulent document, I told him, making no sudden movements. He has no legal authority over this property. Then you need to take that up with a judge on Monday morning, the officer replied. But tonight, you cannot stay here. You need to gather your things and find a hotel. If you try to break a window or force the door, I will have to arrest you for trespassing. Do you understand? I looked at the officer. I looked at the security guard who was practically smirking. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry, to throw myself against the heavy oak door, to validate Mason's lie that I was hysterical and unhinged. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. I maintained absolute control. I understand perfectly, I said. I began dragging my suitcase back down the stone steps. I walked past the police cruiser and the private security vehicle. As I reached the edge of the street, the beam of the street lamp caught a bright orange sticker slapped onto a heavy metal stanchion near the curb. It was a municipal permit. A permit for a commercial construction dumpster to be placed on the street starting the following morning. I leaned in close to read the fine print. The applicant name was not mine. It was not even my mother's. It read Green Harbor Ventures Limited. Mason's newly registered company. I stood perfectly still in the dark. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying precision. Mason was broke. His last boutique motel project had hemorrhaged money. He was drowning in vendor lawsuits and unpaid contractor bills. My parents were financially overextended from years of bailing him out. They did not want my house just to live in it or to keep it safe. The floral arrangements, the fabric swatches, the new company, the dumpster permit. My brother was not just staging an intervention. He was not just stealing my home to soothe his ego. He was preparing to gut it, renovate it without my permission, and monetize it as a luxury event space to save his own sinking ship. He thought he had outsmarted me with a forged signature and a cheap lock. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in 2 weeks. Mason thought he had staged a coup. He did not realize he had just handed a fraud investigator the blueprints to his own destruction. Let him have his new locks. Let him bring in his dumpsters. I was going to let him build his little empire on my stolen foundation. And then, when he was in so deep he could not breathe, I was going to take it all away. I bypassed the luxury hotels downtown and steered my car across the bridge toward the Isle of Palms. My parents' sprawling stucco estate loomed at the end of a manicured cul-de-sac. The driveway was choked with imported SUVs and sleek sedans. The air was thick with the smell of expensive hors d'oeuvres and the rhythmic clinking of crystal. They were not mourning my supposed mental breakdown. They were hosting a cocktail hour. I walked around the side gate, my heels clicking softly against the paving stones. I stopped at the edge of the travertine patio. Suspended between 2 ancient oak trees was a banner of heavy, cream-colored linen with elegant gold lettering. It read, "Congratulations, Mason and Brooke. The Green Harbor House relaunch." That banner had not been ordered this afternoon. Custom calligraphy on high-grade linen required weeks of lead time. They had been planning the theft of my property while I was sitting at their dining table for Sunday dinners, smiling and pouring their wine. I stepped fully onto the patio. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows over a catered spread of oysters, artisanal cheeses, and champagne chilling in silver buckets. Conversations faltered as people noticed me. Aunts, uncles, and my parents' wealthy country club friends paused with their glasses halfway to their mouths. The sudden silence was deafening. A collective holding of breath as the polite society braced for a hysterical scene. Mason was holding court near the fire pit, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He looked like a man who had just conquered a small nation. His chest puffed out, his smile wide and magnanimous. Beside him stood his wife, Brooke, draped in a pastel silk dress that screamed effortless wealth, though I knew for a fact her credit cards were constantly hovering near their maximum limits. Brooke spotted me first. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. A flash of genuine panic, before her face stretched into a mask of aggressive, sugary pity. She drifted toward me, her arms opening for a hug. I smoothly sidestepped by reaching for a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. "Chloe, sweetie," Brooke cooed, her voice pitched perfectly to carry across the hushed patio. "We did not think you would be up for socializing tonight. You look absolutely exhausted. But really, keeping that massive historic property all to yourself, it was selfish of us to let you carry that burden. A single woman simply does not need 10,000 square feet. You were just rattling around in there like a ghost. Now it can actually be useful." She spoke as if I were a squatter who had finally been evicted from a palace I had no right to occupy. In her eyes, I was merely a placeholder, keeping the floors polished until the rightful heirs arrived to claim their due. My mother, Diane, materialized at my elbow. She smelled of juniper berries, tonic, and expensive floral perfume. She placed a heavy, aggressively manicured hand on my shoulder, squeezing tightly enough to dig her acrylic nails into my collarbone. "We are doing this for your own good, darling," Diane announced to the captive audience, her tone dripping with rehearsed maternal sorrow. "You have been so lost in your corporate hunts." tracing other people's money. You forgot how to live. You forgot what matters. Family steps in when a loved one loses their way. It is our duty to save you from your own obsession. We are turning a monument to your isolation into a place of joy. She was brilliant, in a terrifying way. She had taken an act of blatant financial piracy and wrapped it in the impenetrable armor of a mother's love. She was daring anyone on that patio to question their noble sacrifice. My father, Harold, joined the circle, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored linen shirt. He wanted his share of the credit. He always needed to be the architect of the victory. "Exactly," Harold rumbled. Swirling his scotch, he lowered his voice, adopting the conspiratorial tone he used when discussing insider stock tips. It was a messy situation. "Chloe, your affairs were entirely unregulated, but I knew exactly who to call. You know my old friends down at the county registry. A few private lunches, a few quiet conversations about legacy management and conservatorship, and we got the transfer documents expedited smoothly. No red tape, no public embarrassment for you. You should be thanking us for keeping this private. Anyone else would have dragged you through a medical competency hearing in open court." I took a slow sip of my water, my father had just admitted, in front of at least 40 witnesses, to leveraging undue influence and personal relationships to bypass standard property registry protocols. He was bragging about orchestrating a fraudulent transfer of deeds. He thought he was intimidating me with his connections. He was actually handing me a signed confession of conspiracy. Mason stepped closer, emboldened by his parents' unwavering support and his own perceived brilliance. He could not resist the urge to show off the prize. "It is going to be spectacular, Chloe," Mason said, gesturing expansively with his free hand. "We are transforming the main floor into the premier bridal suite and reception hall on the coast. The aesthetic is perfect. In fact, the soft launch is in exactly 10 days. I already have hard commitments and non-refundable deposits from 3 high-net-worth couples and 2 top-tier corporate event planners. Even a couple of angel investors are flying in from New York for the showcase. The capital is already flowing. We are fully booked for the first 6 months." My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. 10 days, 3 couples, 2 planners, 2 investors. Mason had just confessed to accepting commercial deposits on a residential property he did not legally own, for a business that did not legally exist, utilizing a forged title. He was establishing a rigid timeline. In exactly 10 days, he would be committing wire fraud, operating a commercial venue without zoning approval, and exposing himself to massive civil liabilities from multiple wealthy third parties. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not point out the fatal flaws in their grand master plan. I stood there in the golden hour light, surrounded by the people who shared my blood, and I silently logged every single word. I memorized the exact phrasing Harold used regarding the county clerk. I filed away Mason's boast about the unrefundable deposits. I noted the names of the event planners Brooke enthusiastically dropped into the conversation a moment later. They waited for my reaction. The entire patio was holding its collective breath, anticipating the meltdown that would finally justify their narrative. They wanted me to scream so they could shake their heads in sorrow and whisper about my tragic decline. I looked at my mother's fake concern, my father's smug arrogance, Brooke's greedy triumph, and Mason's pathetic desperation masquerading as ambition. I let the silence stretch. I let it become heavy and uncomfortable. I let the ambient noise of the wind in the oak trees fill the void until the smiles on their faces began to look strained and uncertain. Then, I smiled. It was a slow, deliberate curving of my lips. It was not a warm smile. It did not reach my eyes. It was a smile completely devoid of emotion, a cold, calculated expression of absolute certainty. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey enthusiastically walk into a steel trap and bolt the door from the inside. Mason shifted his weight uncomfortably. Brooke's smile faltered, her hand reaching up to touch her throat. My mother dropped her hand from my shoulder as if my skin had suddenly turned freezing cold. Without speaking a single word to any of them, I turned around, walked back across the travertine patio, and left the party, leaving a profound, chilling silence in my wake. The leather steering wheel of my car felt like ice beneath my palms as I drove away from the Isle of Palms. I did not turn on the radio. I needed the absolute silence of the cabin to process the sheer scale of the betrayal I had just witnessed. For years, I had willfully blinded myself to the transactional nature of my family. I had convinced myself that my role was just different, not lesser. As the streetlights flashed across the dashboard in rhythmic intervals, I finally allowed myself to open the mental ledger I had kept locked away for over a decade. I thought about the $95,000. That was the exact amount I had quietly wired to the county tax assessor 3 years ago when my parents received a final notice of intent to seize their estate. They had hosted a lavish summer gala the very next weekend, clinking champagne glasses while I quietly swallowed the panic of draining my savings. I thought about the $42,000 I handed over to cover the delinquent payroll of Mason's failed artisanal restaurant venture. I remembered the $60,000 required to settle the breach of contract when his tech startup inevitably vanished into thin air. I was never treated as a daughter or a sister. I was an underwriter. I was a walking, breathing automated teller machine, programmed to dispense capital whenever the consequences of their relentless, unearned ambition caught up with them. Mason was always the golden heir. He possessed the genetic lottery ticket of effortless charm and a blinding smile. He knew exactly how to wear a bespoke suit, how to captivate a room of potential investors, and how to be the photogenic, charismatic face of the Green family. I, on the other hand, was the grim reality check. I was the one they summoned only when the math refused to add up, when the credit lines maxed out, and when disaster was imminent. They praised his vision while demanding I handle the logistics, which was simply their polite term for paying his debts. Only my grandmother, Evelyn, had possessed the sharp clarity to see through our velvet-lined dysfunction. I vividly recalled the sterile scent of antiseptic and fading lilies in her hospice room during her final days. She had gripped my hand with surprising strength, her skin as thin and translucent as parchment. "They will hollow you out, Chloe," Evelyn had whispered, her eyes fierce and unblinking. "They will take your time, your money, and your spirit, and they will call it family duty. You need a fortress." When the will was read, she had bypassed my parents entirely. She left the historic Charleston property solely to me. It was not an act of blind favoritism. It was a calculated act of preservation. She understood the vultures circling our family tree. She wanted to ensure that, for once in my entire life, I possessed something solid, tangible, and deeply rooted that the rest of them could not mortgage, borrow against, or bleed dry to fund their delusions. I honored her gift by pouring my soul into those walls for 2 entire years. It was not merely a cosmetic renovation. It was a grueling, beautiful excavation of my own identity. I spent countless weekends with my hands blistered, stripping 50 years of cheap, modern paint off the original Heart Cypress paneling. I personally tracked down an obscure, semi-retired blacksmith 2 counties over to hand-forge replacement spindles for the wrought iron balcony, demanding they perfectly match a design that had been lost for nearly 80 years. Every sanded floorboard, every painstakingly restored pane of wavy historic glass, every polished brass fixture was a profound declaration of independence. The house became a living, breathing sanctuary. It was the absolute first place on this earth where I did not have to earn my right to exist by solving someone else's manufactured crisis. That was precisely why they despised it so deeply. My family's resentment had absolutely nothing to do with the astronomical market value of waterfront real estate. They hated that house because it stood as a towering, 3-story proof that I was entirely capable of building a magnificent life completely outside their sphere of influence. I did not need their permission, their social connections, or their shallow approval to create something enduring and beautiful. by simply existing and thriving within those walls. I made them irrelevant. I proved that their narrative of me, the cold, isolated workaholic who needed their guidance, was a complete fabrication. And relevance, I realized with a cold dread, was the only currency Mason had left to his name. I knew the intimate, ugly details of his recent professional catastrophes. His highly publicized boutique motel project up the coast had imploded spectacularly just 6 months ago. He was currently dodging aggressive, ruinous litigation from 3 major hospitality suppliers. He owed nearly $500,000 to unpaid contractors who were leaving increasingly threatening voicemails on his personal phone. Then there was Brooke. Her entire sense of self-worth and identity was inextricably tethered to her precarious standing in the local country club hierarchy. She was suffocating under the crushing weight of their rapidly declining social status. She desperately needed to host galas. She needed her name splashed across the society pages. She needed to project an aura of untouchable wealth. They were drowning in a sea of their own incompetence and greed, and my painstakingly restored sanctuary was the only life raft large enough to keep their inflated egos afloat. To my family, my home was not a place of rest or a piece of history. It was nothing more than a theatrical stage. It was a desperately needed brand relaunch. If Mason could successfully steal the property and immediately market it as a premier luxury venue, he could wash his stained reputation clean overnight. He could secure massive new lines of credit based on projected event revenue. He could confidently spin a narrative of a visionary developer rescuing a neglected asset, seamlessly erasing the reality of a failed entrepreneur stealing a home from his own sister. As I pulled my car into the dimly lit parking lot of an extended stay hotel on the outskirts of the city, the very last trace of familial guilt evaporated from my chest, leaving behind a profound, icy clarity. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark. This was not a tragic familial misunderstanding. This was not a misguided intervention born of clumsy parental love. It was a highly calculated, ruthless, and hostile takeover. They had weaponized the sacred language of care and concern to execute a brazen financial coup. They had expertly packaged their insatiable greed as an act of grace. They had looked at my exhaustion and saw only an opportunity to strike. They truly thought they had broken my spirit by framing me as mentally unstable and incompetent. They believed their own intoxicating lie that I was far too fragile, too overworked, and too beaten down to fight back. They had fatally mistaken my lifelong habit of quiet endurance for fundamental weakness. But endurance is simply the capacity to absorb damage without breaking. What I felt coursing through my veins now was something entirely different. It was a lethal, hyper-focused energy, the ledger of my family history, the one I had balanced with my own sweat and money for over 10 years, was finally closed. The balance was unforgivably deep in the red, and I was no longer willing to write off the losses. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of ruthless acquisition. They wanted to build a kingdom on stolen ground. They just failed to realize that in their arrogance. They had invited a master forensic auditor to the table, and I was about to audit their entire existence. The suite I rented on the 14th floor of a downtown hotel smelled of industrial bleach and stale air conditioning. I did not care. It had high-speed internet and a solid deadbolt. I sat at the small glass desk overlooking the glittering grid of the city, opened my laptop, and bypassed my standard work portals. Instead, I logged into a highly encrypted, private server when I spent 2 years restoring the Harbor House. I did not just hire painters and carpenters. I brought in a specialized firm that handled security for museums and high-value private collections. The house was a registered historical asset. Changes in humidity, temperature fluctuations, or unauthorized structural stress could ruin centuries-old materials. So, I had them install a localized preservation dashboard. Microcameras were seamlessly embedded into the ornate plaster molding, hidden within the grates of the vintage air returns, and integrated into the casings of the smoke detectors. They were designed to monitor the house 24 hours a day. My family thought I was simply paranoid about burglars. They had no idea the house was watching them in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I pulled up the live feed for the main foyer. The morning sun was streaming through the wavy glass windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. At exactly 9 o'clock, the new electronic lock beeped. Mason walked in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. He was not alone. He was trailed by a heavy-set man in work boots, carrying a thick clipboard, a woman aggressively typing on a silver tablet, and a younger man snapping photos with a digital camera. A contractor, an event planner, and a marketing specialist. They fanned out across my entryway, pointing at walls and treating my home like a blank canvas. I maximized the volume on my headphones. "The flow here is entirely wrong for large crowds," Mason said, gesturing broadly toward the grand cypress staircase. "We need to widen this entire corridor. Rip out the bottom half of these stairs. We can put in a sweeping, modern curve or a double-sided landing. Just get rid of the original wood. It squeaks anyway." The contractor frowned, scratching his chin with the end of his pen. "Taking out that staircase involves load-bearing adjustments. We need a structural engineer to sign off, and getting a permit for a historical property down here takes at least 6 to 8 weeks. "We do not have 6 weeks, Mason snapped, his polite veneer cracking instantly. "The showcase is in 10 days. Do not pull a permit. Just list it as an internal cosmetic repair on your invoice. Tear it out tonight when the neighbors are asleep." My hands went completely cold. He was ordering the illegal demolition of a protected architectural feature. The fines for that alone could bankrupt a normal person. But he did not stop there. Mason led the group toward the back of the house, moving into the view of the courtyard camera. "That brick wall on the southern perimeter," he instructed, pointing to the hand-laid masonry that had survived 2 hurricanes. "Knock down a 20-foot section. The catering trucks need a direct loading zone into the gardens. And these lights." He waved dismissively at the antique brass lanterns I had painstakingly rewired. "Trash them. I want industrial truss lighting mounted directly into the brick overhead." I opened a second window on my screen, starting a digital log. I typed unauthorized structural demolition, code violation, destruction of historical property. An hour later, the contractor and the entourage left. Mason retreated to the library, my favorite room in the house. He sat behind my mahogany desk, kicked his feet up, and pulled out his cell phone. I switched to the library camera, zooming in slightly. He put the call on speakerphone. "Yeah, this is Mason Green, Managing Director of Green Harbor Ventures," he said smoothly. "I am calling to initiate an emergency claim on the property I just took over. We just discovered massive, pre-existing water damage and foundational rot in the east wing. It was completely hidden, but it requires immediate mitigation before we can safely open for commercial operations. I need an adjuster to expedite in advance so my crew can start ripping out the drywall." Insurance fraud. He was creating a fictitious disaster to get a rapid cash payout for his illegal renovations. While he waited on hold, he opened his laptop. The camera positioned directly above the bookshelf gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of his screen. I watched as he composed an email to a private, high-interest lending firm. The subject line read, "Commercial Bridge Loan Application." He attached a scanned copy of the forged property management agreement and the fraudulent deed transfer. He was requesting a cash advance of $250,000 to cover venue upgrades. In the same email thread, he authorized an application for a $2 million commercial liability insurance policy, certifying that the property was fully up to commercial code, wire fraud, bank fraud, falsifying corporate documents. The crimes were stacking up so fast, I could barely type them all into my log. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Brooke arrived. She breezed through the front door, linking arms with a frantic-looking wedding photographer. Brooke was completely ignoring the contractor who had returned and was currently using a sledgehammer to smash through the plaster in the adjoining dining room. "The bridal editorial needs to happen right here," Brooke commanded, posing dramatically by the shattered remains of a century-old archway. We will do the soft launch party next Friday. I want champagne towers. I want string quartets. And I want every single high-end planner in this city to see that we own the luxury market now. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband was butchering the house to stay afloat. She just wanted the crown. The sun went down, casting long shadows across my monitors. The house emptied out, leaving only the construction dust hanging in the air. I was about to close the laptop and finally try to sleep when the front door opened again. It was my father. Harold walked in alone, clutching a leather briefcase. He met Mason in the kitchen. I switched the audio feed to maximum sensitivity. Harold poured himself a glass of water from the tap. "I just got off the phone with my guy down at the county registry," Harold said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. I told him to push the paperwork through the system immediately. I told him to let the filings slide through before the clerks in the back office have a chance to look too closely at the beneficiary clauses. I pulled a massive favor for this. Mason, it cost me a lot of political capital. "It is handled, Dad," Mason replied, sounding exhausted but arrogant. "Once the advance from the lender hits the account on Tuesday, we are golden. We will be untouchable." I sat back in my hotel chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The knot of tension in my chest suddenly dissolved into a cold, diamond-hard realization. This was the grand twist. I had assumed Mason was just stealing my house to live rent-free, or perhaps to sell it to pay off his mounting debts. I had underestimated his capacity for criminality. He was not just stealing a piece of real estate. He was transforming my home into a massive, illegal cash-sucking machine. He was using my property as collateral for fraudulent loans. He was extracting bogus insurance payouts to fund unpermitted, destructive construction. He was collecting non-refundable cash deposits from innocent couples and vendors for a business that had absolutely no legal right to exist. And my father was actively participating in the conspiracy by bribing a county official to suppress the truth. They were building a spectacular, highly flammable house of cards. They thought they were brilliant developers pulling off the ultimate business pivot. But sitting in that sterile hotel room, watching their every move, I realized they were not businessmen at all. They were just common thieves leaving a massive, undeniable digital footprint on my private servers. I did not need to scream or fight them for the keys. I just needed to let them keep digging the hole until the dirt caved in on them. The Blind Tiger was a subterranean speakeasy tucked beneath the cobblestones of Broad Street, far from the tourist traps and country club haunts my family frequented. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across the scarred mahogany booth where I sat. Spread across the table, illuminated by a single brass reading lamp, were thick stacks of legal folios, architectural blueprints, and financial ledgers. We looked like a team of surgeons quietly studying a terminal patient's scans just hours before a high-stakes operation. Sitting across from me was June Mercer, a ruthless litigator whose pristine silk blouses belied a predatory legal mind. Beside her sat Nolan Pike, a bespectacled architectural historian who treated antique plaster and heart pine with religious reverence. June tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against a laminated copy of Mason's forged property management agreement. "Your brother is playing checkers on a chessboard he cannot even comprehend," June said, her voice a low, lethal purr. "He assumes this house is a standard piece of residential real estate. He thinks a fabricated power of attorney and a few bribes at the county clerk's office are enough to establish a chain of title. He is fundamentally, catastrophically wrong." She slid a heavy leather-bound document to the center of the table. The gold foil lettering on the cover read, "The Evelyn House Trust." "My grandmother did not just leave me a building," I said, tracing the embossed letters. "She built a fortress." "Exactly," June nodded, her eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. "The property is not held in your name, Chloe. It is the sole asset of the trust. You are the managing beneficiary, meaning you have the exclusive right to reside in it and maintain it. but you do not have the unilateral authority to sell it, mortgage it, or convert it to a commercial enterprise. And more importantly, neither does anyone claiming to act on your behalf. June flipped to a tabbed page deep within the binder. There is a corporate co-trustee, Northfield Legacy Services, an institutional wealth management firm based out of Chicago. Every single transfer of deed, every commercial lease, every major alteration requires the notarized signature of their senior trust officer. Northfield has absolutely no record of Mason's newly formed company. They have signed nothing. Therefore, the entire chain of custody Mason is currently parading around to lenders and insurance adjusters is entirely legally void. It is an empty shell. Nolan leaned forward, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses. He pulled out a large, rolled architectural schematic and smoothed it over the legal papers. It was covered in red warning markers I had added based on the hidden camera footage. The legal shell is just the beginning of his nightmare. Nolan interjected, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage as he looked at the notes indicating the destroyed staircase and smashed brickwork. This property is bound by a strict facade conservation easement, held in perpetuity by the historic Charleston Foundation. In exchange for the massive restoration tax credits you secured over the past 2 years, the structural integrity and historical accuracy of the property are federally protected. Nolan pointed a silver pen at the area marking the rear courtyard. Any unpermitted structural change, especially for commercial exploitation, instantly triggers a clawback provision. The foundation will demand the immediate repayment of every single tax credit dollar granted, plus interest. But it gets worse. The covenant mandates that any unauthorized demolition must be entirely restored to its original historical specifications. Mason is ripping out original heart cypress and hand-laid masonry, I noted quietly, recalling the horrifying sound of the sledgehammer echoing through my monitors. Yes, Nolan said, his expression grim but deeply satisfied. And when the foundation forces him to replace it, he cannot just buy modern lumber from a hardware store. He will be legally compelled to source period-accurate salvaged materials and hire specialized master craftsmen. The restoration costs will be astronomical. We are talking about penalties and reconstruction fees that will easily multiply whatever fantasy profits he thinks he is going to make by 3 or 4 times. June took a slow sip of her martini, the olive resting at the bottom of the glass. And here is the beautiful part. Because Mason is operating on a forged deed and signing fraudulent loan applications to fund this vandalism, he has completely pierced his own corporate veil. His newly minted limited liability company cannot protect him. When the dust settles, the financial liability will not fall on the trust, and it will not fall on you. The debt, the penalties, and the criminal fraud charges will bypass his fake company and attach directly and personally to the man who signed the documents. The trap was perfect. It was a masterpiece of legal and architectural tripwires, laid out by my grandmother and meticulously maintained by me. Mason had barged in, blind and arrogant, swinging a sledgehammer at a loaded bomb. June closed the trust binder with a decisive, satisfying snap. "I have the emergency injunction drafted and ready to file," she said, pulling a sleek tablet from her briefcase. "I can wake up a circuit court judge in 2 hours. We can have the sheriff lock down the property, halt all construction, and freeze his accounts by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He will be out on the street before noon." I looked at the glowing screen of her tablet. It was the safe play. It would stop the damage to the house immediately. But it would also give Mason an exit route. He would play the victim. He would tell the family I had maliciously ambushed him with obscure legal loopholes just as he was trying to save our legacy. My parents would rally behind him, paying his fines, hiding his fraud, and painting me as the vindictive villain who cared more about old wood than her own flesh and blood. I reached across the table and pushed the tablet back toward June. "No," I said, my voice perfectly steady. June blinked, her hand hovering over the screen. Nolan looked up, genuinely bewildered. "Chloe," Nolan warned gently, "every single day he has control of the property, he is destroying irreplaceable history. If he takes a saw to the upper balcony supports, the structural integrity of the entire east wing is compromised. I will have it rebuilt, I interrupted, my tone leaving no room for debate. Every splinter, but we are not stopping him tomorrow. Why? June asked, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face, sensing the dark shift in my strategy. You have him dead right now. Because right now, it is just a private dispute on paper, I explained, leaning back into the shadows of the booth. If we stop him now, he will claim ignorance. He will say it was a misunderstanding about the paperwork. He will quietly declare bankruptcy on that fake company and slither away to plan his next grift, while my parents pat him on the back for trying to be a visionary. I thought about the smirk on the private security guard's face. I thought about Brooke bragging about her new social dominance on the patio. I thought about my father boasting about bribing a county official, and my mother dressing up my eviction as an act of selfless maternal love. I want him to feel incredibly safe, I continued. I want him to sign the predatory loan agreements. I want him to cash the unrefundable deposit checks from the event planners. I want him to believe, with absolute unshakable certainty, that he has won. I want him to invite every single investor, every wealthy country club friend, and every member of my family to marvel at his stolen kingdom. June slowly lowered her hand, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her painted lips. She understood perfectly. The soft launch, June whispered. Exactly 10 days from now. I confirmed. That night is not just a party for him. It is his entire social and financial resurrection. He needs that audience more than he needs oxygen. We are going to let him build the highest pedestal possible, right in the middle of that audience. And then, Nolan asked, the cautious preservationist giving way to the fascinated spectator of a looming execution. Then, I said, picking up a copy of the forged deed and folding it neatly in half, we let the ground disappear from beneath his feet. We do not just take the house back in a quiet courtroom. We make sure there is no narrative left for him to hide behind. Let him accelerate. Let him sign everything. We wait for the launch night. The summons came via a sterile email from a boutique law firm located on the top floor of a glass high-rise in downtown Charleston. It was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. I spent the morning preparing my face. I skipped my usual skincare routine. I used a matte, ashen foundation to wash out my complexion and carefully blended a dull purple-gray shadow under my eyes to simulate days of relentless insomnia. I let my hair air dry without brushing it, letting it hang limp and defeated. When I practiced speaking, I deliberately dropped my voice an octave, letting the edges fray into a dry, exhausted rasp. I had to look exactly like the shattered, unstable woman they had invented in their minds. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the conference room, I was met with the suffocating atmosphere of an inquisition. The family was arrayed around a massive slab of polished marble. Mason sat at the head of the table, flanked by a silent, sharply dressed attorney who looked more like a hired shark than an impartial counselor. My mother and father sat shoulder to shoulder on one side, while Brooke sat opposite them, her posture impeccably straight, a designer handbag resting prominently next to her water glass. They looked at me as if I were a feral animal they had cornered and were now deciding whether to put out of its misery. I pulled out a heavy leather chair at the far end of the table and sank into it, letting my shoulders slump. I did not meet their eyes. Mason slid a thick manila folder across the marble. It stopped inches from my hands. We want to make this as painless as possible. Chloe, Mason began, employing that nauseatingly calm, pastoral voice he used when trying to close a difficult deal. We know you are not in your right mind right now. We know the stress of your job and the isolation of that massive house have finally broken you. We are offering you a clean break. I opened the folder. Lying on top was a cashier's check made out to my name. The amount written across the line was $30,000. It was an offensive, microscopic fraction of what the property was worth. Barely enough to cover a decent security deposit and a few months of rent in a mediocre neighborhood. Beneath the check was a stack of legal documents, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, a blanket waiver relinquishing any and all future claims against Green Harbor Ventures Limited and its officers. And then I saw it. Buried as an addendum on the 5th page was a specific clause stating that I, the undersigned, acknowledged and confirmed that severe structural degradation, including water rot and foundational decay, existed on the premises prior to the transfer of management. Mason was trying to get me to legally validate his insurance fraud. He needed my signature to prove to the adjusters that he had not caused the damage he was currently inflicting with sledgehammers. I stared at the paper, letting my hands tremble just slightly. Brooke leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled fingers. Her voice was dipped in synthetic honey, but her eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "It is really a generous parachute, Chloe," Brooke said softly. "You need to take the money. Find a sensible, small apartment somewhere quiet. Maybe take up a hobby. You just need to relearn how to live normally, without the burden of trying to maintain a lifestyle you clearly cannot handle on your own." I kept my head down, staring at the $30,000 check as if it were a complex math problem I could no longer solve. "You have always been so rigid, Chloe," my mother chimed in. "Perfectly on cue." Diane sighed. An exquisite performance of maternal exhaustion. "Always so cold, always needing to control every single narrative. You never understood what it means to be part of a real family. Family must sacrifice for each other. Mason is trying to build a future, a legacy for all of us, and you are selfishly hoarding an empty building just to spite him. It breaks my heart to see you this bitter." The gaslighting was thick enough to choke on. She was actively reframing a hostile takeover of my only sanctuary as my own moral failing. My father decided it was time to drop the hammer. Harold leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his face hardening into a mask of patriarchal authority. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe," Harold warned, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "You will sign those papers today. If you decide to be difficult, if you try to drag this out or make a scene, I will personally see to it that you become a legal laughingstock in this city. I will file an emergency petition for a mental competency evaluation. I will have a judge declare you unfit to manage your own affairs, let alone a multi-million-dollar trust. We have the police report from the other night. We have the testimony of the security guards who saw you wandering around in a state of delusion. Do not force my hand." They had mapped out every angle. They had built a psychological cage. Convinced I had no choice but to surrender, I slowly lifted my head. I looked at Mason's smug face, Brooke's triumphant sneer, my mother's fake sorrow, and my father's raw aggression. Then, I reached down into the deepest, most agonizing well of my memory. I bypassed the cold, calculating auditor, and summoned the scared, exhausted girl who had spent a decade paying off her brother's failures while her parents watched with indifferent approval. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of taking the one thing my grandmother had given me to protect myself from them. The tears that filled my eyes were not fake. The profound, suffocating grief of realizing you are utterly unloved by the people who brought you into the world is a uniquely devastating pain. It shattered the carefully maintained barrier in my chest. My breath hitched. A hot, stinging tear spilled over my lashes, cutting a track through the dull makeup on my cheek. "She knew," I whispered, my voice cracking, ragged with genuine sorrow. "Grandmother Evelyn knew exactly what you were going to do. She knew you would strip me down to the bone if you ever got the chance. I spent 10 years fixing your messes. Mason, 10 years. I let out a raw, broken sob, burying my face in my hands. The sound echoed off the polished glass walls of the conference room. It was the visceral sound of a total, catastrophic breakdown. "I just wanted one thing." I wept, my shoulders shaking violently. "I just wanted one place that was mine, and you could not even let me have that." The room fell dead silent. The truth in my agony was absolute. It was the one variable they could not manufacture, and it validated their entire twisted narrative. They watched me cry with an almost predatory satisfaction. They believed they had finally broken the unyielding sister they so deeply resented. Mason pushed a heavy gold fountain pen across the marble table. It rolled to a stop against my arm. "Sign the papers, Chloe," Mason said, his voice dropping the pretense of sympathy, revealing the cold, impatient Victor beneath. "It is over." I kept my head bowed. I took a shuddering breath, wiping my nose with the back of my hand like a defeated child. My fingers trembled as I picked up the heavy gold pen. I pulled the stack of documents toward me. I knew with absolute legal certainty that my signature on these papers meant absolutely nothing. The Evelyn House Trust could not be dissolved by a coerced signature on a waiver. A non-disclosure agreement could not shield a crime. And admitting to pre-existing damage did not legalize unpermitted demolition or indemnify him against the historic foundation's wrath. They were worthless pieces of paper. But to Mason, they were the ultimate victory lap. They were the keys to the kingdom. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. I signed the waiver. I signed the non-disclosure agreement. I signed the fraudulent addendum validating the fake structural damage. With every stroke of the pen, I was handing Mason a rope. I was giving him the absolute confidence he needed to walk into the bank, to lie to the insurance adjusters, to cash the vendors' checks, and to invite the entire city to witness his grand ascension. I capped the pen and let it drop onto the marble with a hollow clatter. I did not take the $30,000 check. I left it sitting there, a monument to their pathetic valuation of my life. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. I picked up my purse, my shoulders still hunched, playing the role of the vanquished exile until the very last second. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the glass conference room, leaving my family sitting around the table, quietly basking in the glow of a victory that was about to bury them alive. My phone vibrated against the glass desk of my hotel room. The screen illuminated the darkened suite, displaying a new message notification from Brooke. I unlocked the device, shielding my eyes from the sudden glare. She had sent a rapid-fire barrage of high-resolution images, documenting her hostile takeover of my interior design. The first photograph showed the grand dining room, my antique brass chandelier, a piece that had hung there for 8 decades, was gone. In its place hung a massive, ostentatious fixture made of cascading geometric crystals that looked like it belonged in a flashy Las Vegas nightclub, completely clashing with the historic crown molding. The second image was a close-up of a sample tablescape set up in the parlor. It featured aggressively modern gold-rimmed plates, towering centerpieces of dyed pink orchids, and mirrored name cards. Beneath the gallery of photos was a single line of text from my sister-in-law. "Our home has such better energy now," the caption read. I did not block her number. I did not reply with anger. I simply tapped the screen, saved every single image to a secure cloud folder, and ran a quick extraction protocol to isolate the precise geolocation and timestamp data embedded deep within the image files. She thought she was taunting a defeated woman. She was actually voluntarily submitting time-stamped photographic evidence of unauthorized interior alterations. The following morning, a sponsored advertisement pushed its way to the top of my social media feed. Mason had clearly paid a premium to target local demographics. I clicked play. The video opened with a sweeping drone shot of the harbor, panning dramatically to land on the front porch of my house. Mason stepped into the frame, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked the part of the visionary young developer. "Welcome to the Green Harbor House," Mason declared to the camera, his voice dripping with practiced, persuasive warmth. "For far too long, this magnificent sleeping asset has been locked away from the world, gathering dust. But true legacy requires vision. We are incredibly proud to transform this historic estate into the premier coastal destination for luxury weddings and elite private investments. We are not just opening doors. We are opening a new chapter of low-country elegance. He looked straight into the lens, exuding the absolute confidence of a man who fully believed his own carefully constructed mythology. He had completely erased me from the narrative, rebranding his theft as a noble act of civic and economic resurrection. I downloaded the video file, logged the exact second he publicly claimed commercial ownership, and dropped it into my encrypted dossier. Through my discreet monitoring of the local business registries and network traffic, I watched the mechanics of his fraud accelerate. His newly incorporated entity, Green Harbor Ventures Limited, was actively receiving wire transfers. He was systematically collecting massive, non-refundable retainers. I documented a $15,000 wire from a desperate young bride trying to secure a prime spring wedding date. I tracked a $25,000 deposit from a regional corporate event planner seeking exclusive hosting rights for an upcoming tech summit. He even secured $10,000 apiece from 2 local catering companies just to be placed on his preferred vendor list. Mason and Brooke were treating the stolen capital as their personal victory fund, instantly diverting portions of the incoming wires to pay off Brooke's maxed-out credit cards and settle one of Mason's outstanding lawsuits from his previous failed motel project. They were living lavishly on a borrowed victory, spending money they had acquired through blatant wire fraud. The preservation cameras hidden throughout the house captured the darkest mechanics of their cover-up. On Tuesday afternoon, I watched the high-definition feed from the kitchen as the lead contractor handed Mason a stack of freshly printed invoices. I zoomed in on the document resting on the marble island, where the original preliminary quote had explicitly listed the demolition of the south brick wall and the removal of the historic cypress staircase. The new documents had been scrubbed completely clean. Mason had instructed the contractor to falsify the line items. The invoice now read, "Drywall repair and safety stabilization." Mason was meticulously papering over the violent destruction of federally protected architecture, desperately trying to keep the insurance adjusters and the historic foundation completely in the dark regarding the true nature of his construction zone. But the most deeply sickening detail I witnessed was not financial or structural. It was profoundly personal. I switched the camera feed to the newly staged grand foyer. Brooke had set up a lavish welcome table for their upcoming launch showcase. Right in the dead center of the table, resting on a tufted velvet display stand, was my grandmother Evelyn's leather-bound guest book, the very same book they had carelessly tossed into a cheap cardboard box on the porch just days earlier. Brooke had dusted off the leather cover, opened it to a page from the 1980s showcasing signatures from an old family gathering, and placed a calligraphic placard next to it. The sign read, "A legacy of low-country hospitality." She was actively using the memory of the woman who had despised their greed as a cheap marketing prop to sell a fraudulent dream to her investors. It was a desecration that burned away any lingering fraction of mercy I might have held. My phone vibrated again, breaking my focus. It was a notification from the Green family group chat, a text thread I had kept permanently on mute for over 5 years. My mother, Diane, had proudly posted a link to Mason's promotional video. "So incredibly proud of our boy today," she wrote, adding a string of celebratory emojis. It took some very tough love, but our stubborn girl finally realized she needed to step aside for someone who actually knows how to build a real future for this family. My father, Harold, immediately replied, "A masterclass in aggressive asset management," he typed. "Takes vision to see the potential, and guts to take the wheel." The launch night is going to be spectacular. They were openly basking in the glow of a triumph they believed was bulletproof. I did not type a single character in response. I minimized the chat window and maximized the master spreadsheet on my secondary monitor. I was no longer a grieving daughter or a betrayed sister. I was a senior forensic auditor, and they were simply the subjects of a fatal investigation. I created a cold, chronological, and inescapable ledger. I logged the precise metadata from Brooke's taunting photographs. I transcribed Mason's video, tagging the exact timestamps of his fraudulent commercial claims. I cross-referenced the altered, falsified contractor invoices with the live video and audio feeds of the sledgehammers destroying the original cypress wood. I meticulously mapped out the flow of the non-refundable deposits, matching the incoming bank wires to the specific names of the desperate brides and oblivious corporate sponsors. Every single lie, every altered document, every unauthorized structural demolition, and every fraudulent wire transfer was perfectly sequenced into an airtight, irrefutable timeline. It was a masterpiece of self-incrimination, entirely authored by their own insatiable arrogance. By 2 o'clock in the morning, my digital dossier was complete. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted 4 separate highly classified messages. The first package went directly to the Special Investigation Unit of the commercial insurance provider Mason had brazenly defrauded with his fake water damage claims. The second package, containing the falsified title documents and proof of illegal commercial activity, was routed to the senior anti-fraud compliance officer at the private lending firm that had advanced him the massive bridge loan. The third package went to my attorney, June Mercer, who immediately forwarded the undeniable evidence of fiduciary breach to the senior officers at Northfield Legacy Services in Chicago. The fourth and final email was the heaviest. It contained the high-definition video files of the staircase demolition, the altered contractor invoices, and Brooks' social media posts. I sent it straight to the Emergency Enforcement Division of the Historic Charleston Foundation. I hit send on all 4 emails simultaneously. I watched the progress bars fill, dispatching the raw data into the hands of institutions that possess the power to crush them instantly. But I knew the agencies would not strike the very next day. Bureaucracy required a few days to process, to verify, and to prepare their own warrants and injunctions. The timing was aligning perfectly with the laws of gravity. I closed my laptop, poured myself a glass of cold water, and looked out at the sleeping city, knowing that the invisible gears of their total destruction were finally turning in the dark. The silence that follows a triggered trap is profound. For the next 96 hours, the surface of my world remained completely undisturbed. But beneath the waterline, a massive machinery of consequence was grinding into motion. My encrypted inbox became a quiet, relentless symphony of legal and forensic confirmations. I sat in my dimly lit hotel room, watching the monitors, feeling the tension stretch tight like a drawn bowstring. The Special Investigation Unit at the commercial insurance firm did not immediately flag Mason's account or freeze his access. Instead, their forensic analysts quietly pulled the metadata from the falsified contractor invoices I had provided. They cross-referenced the geolocation tags embedded in Brooks' gloating social media uploads with the city's municipal permit database. The result they found was a mathematical absolute 0 active permits for structural alterations, 0 registered pre-existing foundational damage, and 100% liability on the part of the policyholder. Over in Chicago, the senior trust officers at Northfield Legacy Services reviewed the forged chain of title Mason was using to secure his high-interest loans. The breach of fiduciary duty was so glaringly obvious that their general counsel drafted an emergency notice of reclamation within 4 hours of receiving my file. They prepared to deploy local authorities to seize immediate control of the property. But my attorney, June Mercer, held them back. She orchestrated a synchronized, highly calculated delay. The reclamation order was signed, stamped, and fully legally binding, but the execution was strictly embargoed until Friday night. The Preservation Board of the Historic Charleston Foundation was less restrained in their fury, but equally strategic. They finalized the emergency stop work order. They calculated the preliminary restitution costs for the destroyed historic staircase and the smashed courtyard wall, because the demolition was entirely unpermitted and unauthorized by the true legal owner of the estate. The protective veil of Mason's newly formed limited liability company was rendered legally transparent. The exorbitant fines, the mandatory historic restoration costs, and the punitive damages would not hit a bankrupt corporate entity. They would be levied directly and inescapably against Mason Green as an individual. Listening through the covert microphones, I heard Mason inadvertently seal his own fate. That Thursday afternoon, he took a call from his insurance claims representative. The agent's tone was practiced, cheerfully bureaucratic, and completely deceptive. The adjuster assured my brother that the emergency cash advance for the fictitious water damage was progressing smoothly through the underwriting department and should clear the account by Monday morning. Mason hung up the phone, clapped his hands together, and let out a loud whoop of pure, unearned triumph. He truly believed he had outsmarted the entire financial system. Meanwhile, the private lending firm sent a highly polite email to Brooke, requesting a routine site inspection for Saturday morning, just 12 hours after the grand launch showcase. Brooke enthusiastically agreed, completely unaware that the friendly inspector scheduled to arrive was actually the head of the lender's anti-fraud recovery unit. They were simply waiting for the showcase to conclude so they could document the illegal commercial activity in person before freezing every bank account connected to his name. The illusion of their success was absolute. They were living on borrowed time and stolen money, entirely oblivious to the crosshairs painted on their backs. On Thursday evening, June arrived at my hotel suite. She did not bring her usual stack of legal pads. She brought a sharp, predatory energy that filled the room. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water and leaned against the glass desk, looking out at the city lights. "You have to go to the showcase," June said, her voice a low, commanding murmur. "You have to be in the room." I looked away from the monitor displaying Brooke agonizing over floral arrangements. "If I show up, my father will call security. Mason will use it to prove I am obsessed and unstable." "He cannot," June corrected, a dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. "He wants you there to complete his victory lap. He wants to parade his success in front of you while the whole town watches. He wants to see you break in public. That arrogance is your ultimate leverage. If you are an invited guest, he cannot have his private security remove you without causing the exact chaotic scene he desperately needs to avoid in front of his wealthy investors. His desire to humiliate you is the only shield you need to walk right up to the microphone." Friday morning proved June right. A courier delivered a thick textured envelope to the hotel concierge, explicitly addressed to me. Brooke had taken the time to track down my temporary residence. I carried the envelope back to my suite and sliced it open. Inside was a heavy cardstock invitation with pressed gold foil, granting me VIP access to the inaugural showcase of the Green Harbor House. The aesthetic was sickeningly elegant, a perfect camouflage for the rot underneath. Tucked beneath the formal invitation was a small, cream-colored note card. Brooke had written a single, venomous sentence in her looping calligraphy. "Come see what ambition looks like." I ran my thumb over the raised gold lettering. The sheer, blinding audacity of the phrase crystallized something deep and dormant inside me. I realized that this operation was no longer just about protecting an asset or initiating a legal counterstrike. For my entire adult life, my family had controlled the narrative of my existence. They painted me as the bitter, isolated worker bee, the tragic spinster who lacked the charm and vision they possessed. They used these exact people, the wealthy investors, the country club gossips, the elite planners as their eager audience to diminish me and elevate themselves. They had stolen my home to build a stage, and they were inviting me to watch them perform my defeat. I walked over to the bathroom mirror and turned on the harsh overhead vanity lights. I looked at the pale, matte makeup I had applied for the lawyer's office. I looked at the exhausted posture I had adopted for years to survive their relentless demands. I washed my face. I scrubbed the dull gray shadow from beneath my eyes until my skin was flushed and breathing. I watched the broken, defeated woman wash down the porcelain drain. In her place, staring back at me, was the sharp, unyielding reflection of a senior forensic investigator who held the absolute power to dismantle their reality. I was not just going to drop a silent legal bomb on Mason's finances from the safety of a hotel room. I was going to accept their invitation. I was going to walk onto their stolen stage. look the exact crowd they worshipped dead in the eye, and reclaim the story of my life. I dried my face, set the towel aside, and looked at my reflection one last time. Then I reached for the suit hanging on the closet door. The evening air was thick with the scent of jasmine and expensive cologne. The sprawling front lawn of the harbor house had been transformed into a breathtaking, deceitful masterpiece. Overhead, thousands of tiny amber fairy lights were strung between the ancient branches of the oak trees, casting a warm, cinematic glow over the manicured grass. A string quartet, positioned on the newly paved terrace, played a flawless rendition of a classical concerto. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated effortlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported vintage champagne. The guest list was a meticulously curated cross-section of the city elite. I saw renowned wedding planners examining the floral centerpieces with critical, approving eyes. I spotted two prominent angel investors from New York, leaning against the outdoor bar, deep in conversation with local real estate developers. My parents, Diane and Harold, were holding court near the entrance, practically glowing with borrowed prestige. It was a spectacular display of artificial success. Every single detail was flawless, which only made the impending collapse that much more beautiful. I did not sneak through the side gate. I walked right up the main cobblestone driveway. I had discarded the ashen makeup and the oversized drab clothing from the law firm. Tonight, I wore a tailored, midnight blue silk suit that fit like armor, paired with a sharp, ivory silk blouse and stiletto heels that clicked with authority against the stone. My hair was sleek. My posture was uncompromisingly straight, and my expression was a mask of cold, serene detachment. I looked exactly like the senior corporate investigator I was, stepping onto a crime scene. The transformation was so jarring that conversations began to extinguish the moment I entered the perimeter of the light. Heads turned. Glasses hovered mid-air. The wealthy acquaintances and curious relatives who had expected to see a fragile, broken woman wandering the grounds were instead met with a predator. Mason saw me. He was standing near the grand entrance, laughing with a local politician. When his eyes locked onto mine, the blood drained completely from his face, leaving his artificial tan looking sickly and hollow. Panic, pure and unadulterated, flared in his chest. He abruptly excused himself and marched across the lawn, his jaw clenched, moving to intercept me before I could reach the center of the party. He blocked my path, his chest heaving, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "What are you doing here?" Mason hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward the nearby investors. "You signed the paperwork. You took the deal. Get out before I call the security guards and have you dragged off my property." I did not stop walking. I simply paused for a fraction of a second, reached into my clutch, and retrieved the heavy, gold-foiled cardstock Brooke had sent to my hotel. I held the VIP invitation up high, the golden light catching the embossed lettering, ensuring that the politicians, the planners, and the investors standing 10 feet away could see it perfectly. "I am a VIP guest, Mason," I said, my voice carrying just enough volume to be heard over the string quartet. Brooke insisted I come see what ambition looks like. I would not miss this for the world. Before he could grab my arm or signal his guards, I sidestepped him with practiced ease. I did not head for the bar or the buffet. I walked with absolute unwavering purpose directly toward the elevated wooden stage where a sleek modern microphone stand had been set up for the evening showcase. I climbed the 3 small steps. I stepped up to the microphone. I tapped the metal grill twice. The sharp, percussive sound echoed across the lawn. The string quartet immediately stopped playing. The low hum of conversation vanished, replaced by a dense, suffocating silence. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto me. I looked out over the sea of designer gowns and bespoke suits. I saw Brooke standing frozen near the champagne tower, her fake smile glued to her face. I saw my mother clutching my father by the arm, her eyes wide with sudden terror. And I saw Mason, standing paralyzed in the middle of the grass, watching his worst nightmare unfold in high definition. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice smooth, resonant, and projecting flawlessly through the professional sound system. "My name is Chloe Green. For those of you who do not know me, I am the older sister of your host. I know my brother has worked tirelessly to bring you all here tonight to witness the launch of his new enterprise. I wanted to take a moment to publicly toast his unparalleled vision, and above all, his breathtaking financial recklessness." A ripple of confused, polite laughter spread through the back of the crowd. A few people raised their glasses, assuming this was a quirky, self-deprecating family joke or a strange attempt at public reconciliation. Mason took a step toward the stage, his hands balled into fists, but the sheer number of important people watching him kept him frozen in place. I let the polite laughter fade into absolute stillness before I pivoted. I dropped the pleasant cadence from my voice, replacing it with the sharp, surgical precision of an auditor delivering a fatal report. "However," I continued, my tone dropping the temperature of the entire garden, "I wonder how many of you realize that you are currently raising your glasses inside an active, unpermitted, and highly illegal construction zone. I wonder if the event planners standing by the bar know that this property is not zoned for commercial use, possesses absolutely no operating permits, and is currently bound by a federal historic conservation easement that has been violently violated this week." The atmosphere shattered. The polite smiles vanished instantly from the faces of the investors. The wedding planners, women who made their living on meticulous legal contracts, suddenly looked violently ill. "Stop talking," Mason bellowed, his voice cracking with hysteria as he finally lunged toward the stage. "She is sick. My sister is mentally unwell. Turn off the microphone. The management agreement Mason showed you is a forgery," I stated clearly, speaking over his shouting, ensuring every single syllable hit the back row. "The title to this house is held exclusively by a corporate trust in Chicago, which has never signed a single transfer document. The $2 million commercial liability policy he secured is currently under active investigation for wire fraud. The loan he leveraged against this estate is based on falsified structural damage reports, and to the beautiful couples and corporate sponsors who wired non-refundable deposits to Green Harbor Ventures Limited this week. I am profoundly sorry to inform you that you have handed your money to a fraudulent shell company that has absolutely no legal right to lease this space." The garden devolved into absolute chaos. The whispered conversations turned into loud, frantic demands. The two angel investors set their crystal flutes down on the nearest table and immediately began walking toward the exit. A prominent wedding planner pulled out her cell phone and started aggressively dialing her office. My father, Harold, tried to intercept one of the fleeing investors, but the man simply pushed past him with a look of utter disgust. Mason reached the edge of the stage. His face was purple, his veins bulging against his stiff white collar. "It is a lie," Mason screamed at the crowd, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is bitter. She is bluffing. Everything is perfectly legal. I have the paperwork. I have the accounts." I looked down at him from the podium. I did not yell. I did not gloat. I simply offered him a cold, serene smile. "Are you sure about that, Mason?" I asked softly, stepping slightly away from the microphone, directing my words solely to him, though the surrounding guests could hear every word. "Are you absolutely sure I am bluffing? Take out your phone, right now, in front of all your investors." Mason stared at me, his chest heaving, a bead of cold sweat tracing down his temple. "Open your corporate banking application," I instructed, my voice unwavering. "Open the merchant portal where you processed the vendor payments today. Open the insurance dashboard where you filed your fake drywall claims. Log in and show them the money." His hands were trembling so violently he could barely unlock his device. The crowd closest to the stage pushed forward, forming a tight, suffocating ring around him, watching his screen with morbid fascination. Mason tapped the banking icon. The screen loaded. I watched the exact second his reality collapsed. There were no balances, There were no pending transfers. There was only a massive, glaring red banner stretched across the top of his screen. It read, "Account frozen pending federal fraud investigation." He frantically switched to the event payment portal. Another red banner. "Account suspended." He opened his emails, his thumb slipping against the glass, only to find an emergency reclamation notice from the trust attorneys and a stop-work penalty mandate from the Historical Society, assessing hundreds of thousands of dollars in immediate fines. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the cobblestone terrace with a sharp, cracking sound. No one moved. No one spoke. The beautiful, glowing garden, filled with thousands of fairy lights and expensive flowers, plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. Collapsing onto the lawn, Mason gazed numbly at his fractured phone display, at last realizing that he hadn't forged a grand dynasty. He had merely set the stage for his own spectacular downfall, and I had just pulled the final curtain. The silence on the lawn was not peaceful. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. Before Mason could even comprehend the shattered glass of his phone screen, the heavy wrought iron gates at the edge of the driveway swung open. A procession of figures walked through the amber glow of the fairy lights, moving with a synchronized, grim purpose that completely shattered the lingering illusion of a high society gala. Leading the group was June Mercer, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Beside her walked Nolan Pike from the Historic Foundation, accompanied by two men in dark suits displaying silver badges on their lapels, and a uniformed county sheriff's deputy. They did not mingle. They cut a straight, unforgiving path through the crowd of paralyzed investors and wedding planners, marching directly toward the stage where Mason was still kneeling on the damp grass. A man in a gray suit, representing the commercial lender's anti-fraud division, stepped forward and dropped a heavy stack of manila folders directly onto the turf in front of Mason. "Mason Green," the investigator stated, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. "You are being formally served with an emergency injunction, a comprehensive asset freeze, and a civil suit for multiple counts of wire fraud and falsification of corporate records. Your accounts have been seized. The $2 million bridge loan you secured under false pretenses is being recalled effectively immediately." Nolan Pike stepped forward next, slapping a bright red, laminated notice onto the nearest oak tree. "By order of the Historic Charleston Foundation, this property is under a mandatory stop work enforcement. You are being cited for unpermitted demolition of federally protected architecture. The fines are currently assessing at $10,000 per day, retroactive to your first day of illegal occupation." Mason scrambled to his feet, his tailored suit stained with mud and grass. Panic completely overrode his usual smooth charisma. He lunged toward the outdoor bar where he had left his leather briefcase, intending to grab his remaining files and flee the property. The sheriff's deputy immediately stepped into his path, placing a heavy hand squarely on Mason's chest. "You are not going anywhere, son," the deputy warned, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You need to stay exactly where you are while these gentlemen document the premises. If you attempt to leave this property with any documents, I will place you in handcuffs right in front of your friends." Across the lawn, a different kind of execution was taking place. Brooke was suddenly surrounded by a rapidly forming circle of furious vendors. The lead caterer, a woman who had just realized her $15,000 invoice was worthless, was waving a contract in Brooke's face. "My bank just sent me an alert," the caterer shouted, no longer caring about the country club decorum. "The merchant account you used to pay my deposit has been locked for suspicious activity. I have 20 staff members working here tonight. Who is paying them?" Brooke pulled out her own phone, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it twice. When she finally opened her event management dashboard, the screen was flooded with notifications. Brides were panicking, sending enraged messages as their wedding dates vanished into the void of a frozen calendar. The entire social empire she had planned to rule was disintegrating in real time, leaving her exposed as an accomplice to a massive con. My father, Harold, desperately tried to salvage his own reputation. He puffed out his chest and marched up to the investigator from the insurance firm, adopting his most authoritative, patriarchal tone. "Listen here," Harold demanded. "I am Harold Green. I have personal relationships with the county clerk. There has obviously been a massive administrative error here. I will make one phone call and have this entire misunderstanding cleared up by Monday morning." The investigator did not even blink. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photocopy of a sworn affidavit. "Save your breath, Mr. Green," the investigator replied coldly. "Your friend at the registry office flipped the moment our auditors walked into his department this afternoon. We have the complete notary log, your digitized call records, and his sworn testimony detailing exactly how you pressured him to backdate a fraudulent transfer of deed. You used your remaining political capital to legitimize a felony. You will be receiving your own summons for conspiracy by the end of the week." The local politicians and wealthy acquaintances standing nearby physically recoiled from Harold. In a matter of seconds, he went from a respected elder statesman to a toxic liability. His social standing evaporated into the humid night air. Then, my mother broke. Diane pushed her way through the whispering crowd and grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my silk sleeve. The mask of the elegant, long-suffering mother was entirely gone, replaced by raw, ugly desperation. "Chloe, stop this," Diane pleaded, her eyes darting frantically around the lawn, realizing the entire city elite was watching her family burn. "Tell them to stop. He is your brother. We are your family. You cannot destroy us over a house. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please, Chloe, we are blood." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply looked into her eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold. Clinical clarity. The crowd watched in breathless silence. They did not see a heartwarming plea for familial grace. They saw a woman who was perfectly willing to throw her daughter onto the tracks to stop the train from hitting her son. "You ceased being my family the day you changed my locks and told me I was losing my mind," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "You made your choices, Diane. Now you get to live in the house you built." I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my sleeve. June Mercer took the microphone on the stage. She adjusted her glasses, her presence commanding the absolute attention of the remaining guests. "For the record," June announced, her voice echoing across the harbor, "legal control of this estate has officially reverted to the Evelyn House Trust. Every single commercial contract, lease agreement, and vendor promise signed by Mason Green or Green Harbor Ventures is legally void. Furthermore, the immense cost of restoring the historical damage inflicted on this property will not be paid by the trust. It will be aggressively pursued and extracted directly from the personal assets of the individuals who authorized the vandalism." It was the final nail. There was no corporate bankruptcy that could save Mason. He was personally, financially ruined for the rest of his natural life. The exodus was swift and silent. The investors practically sprinted to their cars. The wedding planners gathered their assistants and fled. Within 30 minutes, the sprawling lawn was entirely empty, save for the caterers furiously packing their equipment, and my family, who were currently being interrogated by the investigators under the harsh glare of the security lights. I did not stay to watch them cry. I turned my back on the lawn and walked through the heavy front doors into my house. The interior was a disaster zone. I walked past the cheap, garish crystal chandelier Brooke had hung in the dining room. I stepped over the piles of drywall dust and the jagged, exposed framing where my beautiful cypress staircase used to be. I looked at the boxes of expensive, unhung velvet curtains stacked in the corner. A week ago, seeing this destruction would have broken me, but walking through the silent rooms now, I realized I did not feel the old, suffocating pain anymore. The ghosts of my family's relentless demands and unearned entitlement had finally been evicted. The mess on the floor was just wood and plaster. It could be rebuilt. I had the money. I had the time. And most importantly, I had the absolute freedom to do it on my own terms. I walked out to the back terrace and looked at the large, detached carriage house sitting at the edge of the property line. It was a beautiful structure, structurally sound but currently used only for storage, standing there in the quiet night. The final piece of my grandmother's legacy fell into place. I made a decision that would ensure my family could never, ever touch this place again. I was not going to sell the estate, and I was certainly not going to run away. I was going to restore the main house to its exact, original glory, dedicating every single brick to Evelyn's memory. But the carriage house would become something entirely new. I decided to convert it into a fully funded short-term sanctuary. It would be a residential scholarship program for women who were actively rebuilding their lives after experiencing severe financial abuse and familial fraud. I would use my expertise to help them untangle their stolen assets, giving them a safe, beautiful fortress to rest in while they prepared to fight back. I was going to transform the very ground my brother tried to steal into a living, breathing weapon against men exactly like him. It was a beautiful, devastating legacy, one that secured my freedom forever and left my family locked outside the gates for the rest of their lives. I turned away from the terrace and went back inside. For the first time in my life, the house was fully mine not because I had inherited it, but because I had finally defended it.